Oh, is that the best you can do? I expected more from this esteemed court. Honestly, it's beneath me.
The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open at exactly 1:45 in the afternoon, but it wasn't the sound of the hinges that caught everyone's attention. It was the sheer suffocating aura of entitlement that walked through them. Richard Caldwell didn't just enter the room, he occupied it. At 42 years old, he was the walking definition of new money success. He wore a custom-tailored Tom Ford suit that cost more than a teacher's yearly salary, and his Italian leather shoes clicked against the floor with a rhythmic, annoying sense of superiority. As he walked toward the defense table, he didn't look at the flags, the seal of justice, or the people waiting for their turn. His eyes were glued to his Patek Philippe Nautilus, a $150,000 timepiece that he flicked impatiently, as if the law itself was running on his personal schedule. Behind him, a small army followed. Two high-priced attorneys from Boston and a young assistant frantically tapping on an iPad. Richard wasn't even off his phone. He was barking orders about quarterly earnings and stock options, his voice echoing off the marble walls, showing a complete disregard for the sanctity of the court. The bailiff had to ask him 3 times, not once, not twice, but 3 times, to end his call. Richard finally hung up with a dramatic sigh, rolling his eyes, as if being asked to follow a simple rule was a personal insult to his status. He leaned over to his lead attorney, Patricia Stevens, and whispered loud enough for the first 2 rows to hear, "Let's make this quick. I have a jet waiting at the airport. I don't have time for small-town theatrics." High above the bench, Judge Simpson sat in silence. In his 37 years on the bench, he had developed a moral radar that was never wrong. He didn't see a successful CEO. He saw a man who had lost his connection to the ground. He saw a man whose internal arteries of empathy were completely blocked by the plaque of wealth. Judge Simpson looked down at the file. Case number 2024 TRF 2098. The State versus Richard James Caldwell. The charges were chilling, especially for a community that prides itself on looking out for one another. Reckless driving, running a red light, and, the most heart-wrenching of all, illegally passing a stopped school bus while traveling 62 miles per hour in a 25-mile-per-hour school zone. "Mr. Caldwell, please step to the podium and put your phone away," Judge Simpson said. His voice was calm, like the eye of a storm, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. Richard straightened his silk tie, smirked at his lawyers, and walked forward with the relaxed arrogance of someone who believes every person in the world has a price tag. "Your Honor," Richard started, not even waiting to be addressed, "I appreciate your time, but I'm a very busy man. I run TechVantage Solutions. We're an $800 million firm. My time is literally worth thousands of dollars a minute. So if we could just skip the lecture, tell me the fine, and my assistant will cut the check right now. I'm sure the city could use the donation." A heavy silence fell over the room. The air grew cold. You could hear a pin drop. Judge Simpson slowly removed his glasses and leaned forward. He didn't look at the lawyers. He didn't look at the expensive suit. He looked straight into Richard's soul. "Mr. Caldwell," the judge whispered, "in this room, your $800 million is worth exactly 0. In this room, the only currency I accept is respect for the law and the safety of our children. And right now, sir, you are morally bankrupt." Richard Caldwell didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back, crossing his arms over his expensive suit with a smirk that suggested he found the entire proceeding beneath him. "Your Honor, let's be realists here," Richard said, his voice dripping with a polished corporate condescension. "In the world of high-stakes business, we make executive decisions every hour. That morning, I evaluated the situation. The bus was stopped, yes, but I saw no children on the pavement at that exact second. I was in the middle of a $50 million acquisition with Tokyo. My investors were waiting. I made a calculated risk to move past the bus so I wouldn't lose the deal. It wasn't reckless. It was strategic." Judge Simpson leaned forward, his eyes narrowing behind his spectacles. "Strategic," he repeated slowly, tasting the word like it was something bitter. Mr. Caldwell, you talk about your business like it's a living organism, but you treat a school zone like a video game. You say you evaluated the situation. Let's see what the data actually shows. Because in my experience, when the arteries of a community are flowing with children, there is no such thing as a strategic speed of 62 miles per hour. The judge signaled to the clerk. Play the dash cam footage from Officer Chen's vehicle. The lights in the courtroom dimmed. On the large monitor, the footage appeared. You could see the bright yellow school bus pulled over on Elmwood Avenue. Its red lights were flashing like a warning heartbeat, and the stop sign arm was fully extended, a universal signal that means life is present here. Then, a silver Tesla Model S blurred into the frame. It didn't just pass, it roared. The car veered into the opposite lane, narrowly missing a 73-year-old crossing guard who had to jump back toward the sidewalk in terror. You could see the small heads of children looking out the bus windows, turning in shock as the silver blur screamed past them. But it was the audio that made the courtroom gasp. Richard's window was cracked open. As he sped past the bus driver, his voice was caught clearly on the recording, shouting, "Get a real job. Some of us have actual work to do." The lights came back up. The smirk on Richard's face had finally vanished, replaced by a nervous twitch in his jaw. Judge Simpson let the silence hang for a long, uncomfortable minute. "A calculated risk, Mr. Caldwell?" the judge asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a gavel strike. "You calculated that your real job gave you the right to treat those children like obstacles. You calculated that your $50 million was worth more than the life of that man on the corner." Richard opened his mouth to protest, but the judge held up a single hand. "Don't. You've spoken enough. Now it's time for you to meet the people you almost erased from the map." Richard Caldwell sat back down, his face a shade of pale that no expensive bronzer could hide. He leaned toward his lead attorney, Patricia, whispering frantically, trying to find a legal loophole to discredit the video. But Judge Simpson wasn't looking for a legal debate anymore. He was looking for a heartbeat. The judge took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on a specific spot at the back of the room. He wasn't just a man in a black robe. He was the guardian of the neighborhood, and he was about to bring the neighborhood to Richard. "Mr. Caldwell," Judge Simpson said, his voice echoing with a newfound gravity. "You've told us about your $50 million deal. You've told us about your $800 million company. Now I want you to meet the people who don't show up on your balance sheet. I want you to meet the people you considered to be calculated risks." The judge signaled to the back of the room. A man stood up. He was thin, wearing a faded green windbreaker and a neon safety vest draped over his arm. His hands were calloused and his hair was as white as the chalk on a chalkboard. This was Robert Chen. He was 73 years old, a retired school teacher who had spent the last 12 years standing on that same corner, 5 mornings a week, rain or shine. "Robert," the judge said softly, "tell Mr. Caldwell what happened that morning at 7:52. Robert stepped forward, his voice trembling slightly, not from age, but from the memory of the terror. "I've seen a lot of things on that corner, Your Honor," Robert began, looking straight at Richard. "I've seen kids grow up. I've seen them go from kindergarten to high school, but I have never felt the wind of a car so close to my back that it nearly knocked me over. When that silver car roared past, I didn't see a CEO. I saw a weapon. My only thought was the children behind me. I went home that morning and I sat at my kitchen table and I cried. I cried because I realized that if I had been 6 inches to the left, I wouldn't be here to see my grandson graduate next month. And for what? So someone could make a phone call?" Richard looked away, staring at the mahogany table, but the judge wouldn't let him hide. "Look at him, Richard," Simpson commanded. "Look at the man who volunteers his time to keep the real jobs of the future safe. You called him a joke. You told the bus driver to get a real job. Is his life part of your strategy?" Before Richard could answer, another woman stood up. Her name was Sarah Martinez. She was holding a crumpled tissue, her eyes red from a lack of sleep. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice cracking. "My daughter Emma was on that bus. Emma has autism. She doesn't understand calculated risks. She only understands that the big yellow bus is her safe place. When your car screamed past, the bus shook so hard that Emma screamed. She didn't sleep for 3 nights because she was terrified that the silver monster was coming back for her. You didn't just break a law. You broke her sense of safety in a world that is already loud and scary for her. The silence that followed was suffocating. Richard Caldwell, the man who handled high-stakes negotiations with global titans, found himself unable to find a single word. His lawyers looked at their shoes. The arteries of his arrogance were finally being pressured by the weight of human reality. Judge Simpson leaned back, his gaze cold and unwavering. The voices of the invisible had spoken, and the million-dollar suit was starting to look very, very small. The silence in the courtroom was no longer just quiet, it was heavy, pressing down on Richard Caldwell like the weight of the silver Tesla he used as a getaway car from his own conscience. He sat there, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to adjust his silk tie, but the fabric felt like a noose. For the first time in his life, his wealth couldn't buy the air in the room. Judge Simpson didn't look away. He let the words of the victim settle into the cracks of Richard's ego, waiting for the reality to sink in. "Mr. Caldwell," Judge Simpson finally spoke, his voice dropping an octave, resonating with a frequency that made the mahogany bench vibrate. "You have spent this entire morning telling me about the value of your time. You've told me about $50 million deals and $800 million companies. You've treated this court like a minor inconvenience, a bug on the windshield of your private jet. But as you sat there listening to Robert and Sarah, did you calculate the cost of a human soul? Did you calculate the price of a mother's peace of mind? Or is your spreadsheet not equipped for that kind of data?" Richard opened his mouth to offer a rehearsed apology, a corporate regret for the misunderstanding, but the judge cut him off with a sharp glare. "Don't bother with the PR script, Richard. I'm not interested in your brand management. I'm interested in justice. And justice in this court is the great equalizer. Here, the man in the $5,000 suit stands on the same level as the man in the neon safety vest." The judge picked up his pen, the scratching sound of the nib against the paper echoing like a drum beat. "The standard fine for your infractions, the speeding, the red light, the passing of the bus, would normally be around $750. To you, that's less than the cost of the wine at your last business dinner. It's not a punishment, it's a transaction, and I don't do transactions." Judge Simpson stood up, a rare move that signaled the gravity of the moment. "I am imposing the maximum financial penalty of $2,000, but that's just the beginning. I am suspending your driver's license for 6 months, effective immediately. You have an $800 million company. I'm sure you can afford a driver or an Uber. Your days of treating our streets like a personal racetrack are over." Richard's face turned from pale to a deep, bruised purple. 6 months, Your Honor, that's insane. I have meetings across the state. I have to be in Boston by... "You will be exactly where the law tells you to be," Simpson interrupted, his voice cold as the Atlantic in winter. "And there is more. I am sentencing you to 100 hours of community service, but you won't be picking up trash on the highway where no one can see you. No, Mr. Caldwell. You will report to Elmwood Elementary School. You will serve those 100 hours as a crossing guard, under the direct supervision of Mr. Robert Chen, the man you told to get a real job." The courtroom gasped. Richard's jaw dropped so low it seemed it might hit the floor. "A crossing guard? You want me to stand on a street corner in a yellow vest like a volunteer? I'm the CEO of Tech Vantage. I have responsibilities." "Your only responsibility for the next few months," Judge Simpson said, leaning over the bench until he was inches from Richard's face, "is to ensure that every single child on that bus gets across the street safely. You will stand in the rain, you will stand in the wind, and you will learn that the most important executive decision in this city isn't made in a boardroom. It's made on a street corner with a handheld stop sign. If you miss a single morning, if you are 1 minute late, or if you show a single shred of disrespect to Mr. Chen, I will find you in contempt and you will trade that Tom Ford suit for an orange jumpsuit for 90 days. Do I make myself clear?" Richard Caldwell looked around the room looking for a way out, for a connection to call, for a lawyer to save him. But Patricia, his high-priced attorney, simply looked at the floor and nodded. The calculated risk had finally backfired. The king of Tech Vantage had just been stripped of his crown, handed a whistle, and told to go to work. The following Monday morning arrived with a biting, gray chill that seemed to seep through the very bones of the city. At exactly 7:15, a black town car pulled up to the corner of Elmwood Avenue. Richard Caldwell stepped out, but he wasn't driving. True to the judge's orders, he was now a passenger in his own life. He was still wearing a charcoal suit, but the crisp white shirt underneath felt like a starch-heavy prison. He looked at the sidewalk, his $2,000 Italian loafers already catching the morning dampness of the gutter. Waiting for him on the corner was Robert Chen. The retired teacher didn't say a word at first. He simply held out a bundle of fluorescent yellow mesh. It was the vest. To Richard, it looked like a radioactive rag. To Robert, it was a badge of protection. "Put it on, Mr. Caldwell," Robert said, his voice steady and unimpressed. "And you might want to tuck that silk tie inside. The wind on this corner doesn't care about your brand names." Richard took the vest with 2 fingers, as if it were contaminated. He slipped it over his Tom Ford blazer, the neon yellow clashing violently with the expensive fabric. He looked ridiculous, a titan of industry dressed like a construction hazard. He stood there, arms crossed, checking his watch every 30 seconds, waiting for his sentence to be over before it had even truly begun. But the street didn't care about his schedule. As the clock ticked toward 8 o'clock, the arteries of the neighborhood began to pulse. The quiet morning was suddenly shattered by the roar of engines, the screech of brakes, and the thick, heavy scent of diesel exhaust. Hundreds of cars began to pour through the intersection, a river of steel and glass driven by people who were just as stressed, just as late, and just as busy as Richard had been just 1 week ago. For the first hour, Richard stood on the curb, feeling invisible. Drivers honked at him. A woman in a minivan screamed at him to get out of the way because she was late for a meeting. He felt the literal wind of a speeding SUV whip past his face, missing his elbow by less than 3 inches. He felt the ground shake beneath his feet. For the first time, Richard wasn't the one behind the wheel. He was the one in the crosshairs. He was no longer the hunter. He was the prey. Robert Chen watched him from the other side of the street. He didn't offer sympathy. He offered a handheld stop sign. "It's time, Richard," Robert called out over the noise. "The bus is turning the corner. Emma is on that bus. Your executive decision starts now. Get out there and be their shield." Richard Caldwell stepped off the curb, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way that no boardroom negotiation ever had. He raised the stop sign, his hand trembling as a massive delivery truck bore down on him, its brakes hissing like a predatory animal. In that moment, the $150,000 watch on his wrist didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the yellow bus pulling up behind him and the 32 lives that were counting on a man in a neon vest to stand his ground. The second week on the corner of Elmwood Avenue didn't get easier, it just got louder. The adrenaline that had carried Richard through the first few days had evaporated, replaced by a cold, numbing exhaustion. His expensive charcoal suit had been replaced by a heavy parka and rugged boots, yet the fluorescent yellow vest remained, now stained with the salt and grit of the morning commute. Richard Caldwell, the man who used to command boardrooms with a single glance, was now at the mercy of the weather and the whims of distracted drivers. It was during the peak of the Tuesday morning rush when the mirror finally appeared. Richard was standing in the center of the lane, his handheld stop sign raised high. The air was thick with the smell of exhaust and the impatient vibration of idling engines. That was when he saw it, a sleek, white Italian sports car weaving through traffic, cutting off a minivan and accelerating toward the crosswalk. The driver was a young man, barely 30, with a Bluetooth headset glued to his ear and a face tight with the same frantic, self-important energy Richard knew all too well. The young man didn't see the bus. He didn't see the crossing guard. He only saw the gap in traffic. He sped up, the engine roaring with a high-pitched scream. Richard didn't think. He didn't calculate a risk. He didn't check his watch. He stepped further into the lane, planting his feet firmly on the asphalt. He stared directly through the windshield of the oncoming car, holding the stop sign like a shield. The brakes of the sports car screeched, the tires smoking as the vehicle buckled to a halt just inches from Richard's knees. The young driver rolled down his window, his face flushed with rage. "Are you kidding me? I have a closing in 20 minutes. Get out of the way, old man." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. Old man. Get out of the way. They were his own words, echoed back at him from a different mouth. He looked at the young man and didn't see a stranger. He saw a ghost of his former self. He saw the artery of arrogance that Judge Simpson had described. A blockage of the soul that made a person believe their time was more precious than a life. Richard leaned toward the driver's window. He didn't shout. His voice was low, steady, and carried a weight that made the young man blink in surprise. "There is nothing in that boardroom more important than the children on this bus," Richard said, his breath ghosting in the cold air. "I used to think like you. I thought I was the sun and the world moved around me. But look at where I am, and look at what you almost did. Take a breath. The world will wait. The children won't." The driver stared at him, the anger momentarily replaced by a flicker of confusion, perhaps even shame. He muttered an apology and sat back, the roar of his engine dying down to a hum. As the bus doors opened and the children began to file out, Emma Martinez, the little girl who had been terrified of the silver monster, walked past Richard. She stopped for a brief second. She didn't say anything, but she reached out and touched the yellow mesh of his vest with one finger. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and calm. And for the first time, she didn't shrink away. She saw the shield, not the monster. Robert Chen watched from the sidewalk, a small, knowing smile touching his lips. Richard felt a sudden, sharp sting in his eyes that had nothing to do with the wind. The calculated risk had finally been replaced by a human connection. The billionaire was starting to understand that the most valuable thing he owned wasn't his company. It was the safety he could provide to a child who didn't even know his name. The 2-month mark of Richard Caldwell's sentence arrived not with a celebration, but with a summons. As part of Judge Simpson's unconventional ruling, Richard wasn't just required to stand on a street corner. He was required to face the community he had dismissed as small-town theatrics. The venue was the Elmwood Elementary Gymnasium. The air smelled of floor wax, old gym mats, and the palpable cold tension of 150 parents who had gathered for the monthly PTA meeting. Richard stood in the shadows of the hallway clutching a piece of paper. It was a 3-page apology letter, meticulously drafted by a $500 an hour public relations firm in New York. It was filled with words like unfortunate oversight, commitment to community values, and strategic realignment of personal priorities. It was a masterpiece of corporate damage control, polished, professional, and completely hollow. As he stepped onto the modest wooden stage, the room fell into a silence so absolute it felt like the air had been sucked out of the building. In the front row sat Judge Simpson, his black robe replaced by a simple suit, but his eyes still carried the weight of the bench. Next to him were Robert Chen and Sarah Martinez. Richard looked out at the sea of faces, fathers in work shirts, mothers who had just come from second shifts, and for the first time in his career, the man who had closed billion-dollar deals felt his knees shake. He began to read. "I stand before you today to express my deep regret for the events of October 21st. His voice was steady, the practiced tone of a CEO delivering an annual report. But as he reached the second paragraph, his eyes drifted from the paper to the third row. There sat Emma Martinez. She was holding a small hand-drawn picture of a yellow bus. She wasn't looking at the titan of Tech Vantage. She was looking at the man who had held the stop sign for her every morning for the last 60 days. Richard stopped. The PR script in his hand suddenly felt like lead. He realized that these people didn't want a corporate statement. They wanted the truth. They wanted to know if the man who almost killed their children actually understood the value of the lives he had risked. Richard slowly folded the expensive paper and tucked it into his pocket. He stepped away from the microphone, moved to the edge of the stage, and looked directly at the crowd. "I had a speech prepared," Richard said, his voice cracking, losing its professional sheen. "My lawyers told me what to say to protect my image. But as I stand here, I realized I've spent 42 years building an image, and I spent 10 seconds on a street corner almost destroying a family. I have a 14-year-old daughter named Chloe. She is the center of my world. And for 2 months, every time I saw a car speed past my stop sign, I didn't see a calculated risk. I saw a weapon pointed at my own daughter." He paused, a lump forming in his throat that no amount of money could swallow. "I called your lives a joke. I called the people who protect your children unimportant. I was a man who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. I don't ask for your forgiveness tonight because I haven't earned it yet. I only ask that you know, for the first time in my life, I finally see you. I finally see the real jobs that actually matter." A single tear escaped his eye, carving a path through the mask of the millionaire. Then another. The arrogant millionaire was gone. In his place stood a father, broken by his own reflection, weeping in front of the people he once thought were beneath him. The arteries of his heart were finally open, and the blood of human empathy was pouring through. 6 months had passed since the day Richard Caldwell first stepped into Judge Simpson's courtroom with $1 million watch and a bankrupt soul. The headline-grabbing trial had faded from the news cycles, but the transformation inside Richard was only beginning to reach its peak. On a crisp Tuesday morning in April, the black town car was gone. In its place, a modest silver SUV pulled up to the curb of Elmwood Avenue. Richard stepped out, not as a passenger, but as a man who finally understood the weight of the wheel in his hands. He wasn't wearing a Tom Ford suit anymore. He wore a simple flannel shirt, durable work pants, and that same fluorescent yellow vest. Only now it didn't look like a vest of shame. It looked like a uniform of honor. It was his final official day of court-ordered service. But as the school bus pulled up and the red lights began to flash, Richard didn't check his watch once. He moved with a calm, purposeful grace, standing in the gap between the heavy traffic and the children. When Emma Martinez stepped off the bus, she didn't just touch his vest. She handed him a small plastic gold medal she had made in art class. On the back, in messy purple crayon, it said, "To my hero." Richard swallowed hard, the lump in his throat becoming a permanent resident whenever he stood on that corner. He realized then that he had closed the greatest deal of his life. He had traded his arrogance for the trust of a 7-year-old girl. Later that afternoon, Richard stood once more in Judge Simpson's chambers. The atmosphere was different. There were no high-priced attorneys, no frantic assistants, and no cameras. Just two men and the quiet ticking of a grandfather clock. Richard handed over his completed logbook, signed by Robert Chen. "I'm told you've implemented some changes at TechVantage," Judge Simpson said, leaning back in his chair with a faint, proud smile. Richard nodded. "We have a new policy, Your Honor. No employee is allowed to answer a call or a text while driving, period. We've also started a foundation that provides safety equipment and stipends for crossing guards across the state. But more than that, I've started driving myself to work. I like the reminder. I like the feeling of the road, knowing that every person I pass is someone's Robert or someone's Emma." Judge Simpson stood up and walked around the desk, extending his hand. He didn't offer a lecture this time. He offered a hand of fellowship. "Mr. Caldwell, I have seen thousands of people pass through my court. Most pay their fines and leave with a grudge. A few pay their fines and leave with a lesson. But you are the rare soul who paid with his ego and left with a heart. You came in here a CEO of a company, but you're leaving as a leader of a community. That is the only success that survives the test of time." As Richard walked out of the courthouse and into the bright afternoon sun, he didn't reach for his phone. He didn't call his brokers or check the stock market. He simply took a deep breath of the fresh air and looked toward the school. He knew that the world was still moving fast, that people were still rushing, and that many were still making calculated risks. But as long as he had a voice and a vest, he would make sure the world slowed down long enough to remember what really matters. The story of the arrogant millionaire didn't end with a tearful apology. It ended with a quiet, persistent legacy of safety. Because sometimes the greatest act of justice isn't the punishment that breaks a man, it's the responsibility that makes him whole. And in the court of life, Judge Simpson's final ruling was clear. No deal is worth a life, and no status is higher than the one we earn when we look out for the smallest among us.